Welcome back to the Book Nook, everybody. Today we're going deep, really deep into a really fascinating book. It's called Marxism, Philosophy and Economics, and it's by a pretty well-known economist, Thomas Sowell. And actually, this is one that you suggested to us because, well, you're interested in like why Marxism, which has been so influential as an ideology, why has it faced so much criticism over the years?
Yeah, it's a big question, and particularly when you think about like it hasn't always delivered on all those big promises.
Right, exactly, exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack Sowell's analysis in this book and really try to get to the core of, what are his main arguments about why Marxism, both as like a theory and in practice, seems to fall short.
Yeah, I think that's a great goal for this deep dive because Sowell really, this book is the culmination of over like 25 years of research on Marx and Engels. So he really went deep, right? And he wants to, cut through all the extraneous stuff and get to the essence of what they were really saying.
Okay.
And I think, one of the things that he highlights is that understanding Marx's philosophy is really essential to understanding his economics. Even though you can, kind of consider them logically independent, he really sees them as intertwined.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's kind of like to really understand his economic theories, you have to go deeper and look at the philosophical background that sort of, inform that.
Exactly. Yeah. And, Sowell really argues that many interpretations of Marxism kind of, miss the mark because they don't really consider that original philosophic framework. They try to jump right into the economics.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, well, let's jump into it then. We'll try to take that approach as well. And I guess for this deep dive, we should probably focus on Sowell's, exploration of what he sees as kind of like the inherent weaknesses in Marxist thought.
Okay. Yeah.
And particularly, I think, looking at things like central planning, the whole idea of economic incentives and the historical record, how have Marxist policies actually played out in history?
Right.
You know?
Big topics.
Yeah. Big, complicated topics. But, we'll work through it. We'll work through these ideas, try to keep things clear, and hopefully, hit on some of those aha moments that Sowell's analysis is known for, right? So maybe a good starting point would be to look at what Sowell sees as a core problem with the whole idea of central planning.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start because, what's really fascinating is that Sowell, he actually uses some of Marx's own observations about capitalism to highlight the challenges of central planning.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, for example, Marx recognized how complex it was to coordinate, all of the different parts of a market economy.
Right.
And he even describes it as this kind of a posteriori nature-imposed necessity, which sounds very complicated.
Yeah, that does sound complicated.
But basically what he means is that, the market kind of figures things out after the fact through this process of trial and error.
Right. So it's not like there's somebody in charge who's sort of directing everything. It's more like things sort of happen organically.
Yeah, exactly.
And the way they sort of work themselves out is through, prices going up or down. It's sort of like a signal.
Exactly. Prices are the signals, right? And Sowell kind of takes this observation and he says, well, if it's this complex under capitalism, imagine trying to replace that with a central authority.
Right. Like some group of people who are trying to manage everything from the top down.
Exactly.
That seems like a lot.
Right. How would they possibly gather and respond to, all those ever-changing demands and supplies across a whole economy?
Yeah.
Without those price signals that Marx himself was talking about?
That's a really good point. Yeah, that seems like they'd be lacking a lot of the information that they need to actually make those decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that kind of makes sense. But I'm kind of curious, like, did Marx have anything to say about this whole issue of, the market versus central planning? Like, what was his take on all of that?
Yeah, well, actually, Marx himself pointed out that under capitalism, the way all the different jobs and industries are connected, it's not entirely planned.
Oh, okay.
He said it involves both, some degree of like intentional planning, like within a particular workshop or a factory.
Okay.
But then there's also this like spontaneous, he calls it accidental coordination that happens across society as a whole.
Interesting.
So like, one factory might be producing something that then gets used as an input in a totally different factory. And that's not necessarily something that anybody planned out.
Right. That just kind of happens organically. So how does that relate to central planning then?
Well, central planning, the whole goal is to kind of eliminate that accidental element, right? Like to have everything be planned and coordinated from the top. But Sowell's argument is that, when you try to do that, you inevitably run into this problem of information processing.
Right. Because it's like trying to replicate what the market does naturally, but without having all of that same information that the market has access to.
Exact.
So it's like you're kind of flying blind almost.
Right. And Sowell even points to, instances where Marx himself seemed to acknowledge this difficulty.
Oh, really?
Like there's this one quote where Marx talks about how even when you have, the necessary labor going into making something, across the whole economy, it might turn out that there was like, superfluous labor time spent on them.
So even if everybody's working hard and producing things, it doesn't necessarily mean that those are the right things or the right amount of those things that are needed.
Exactly. It's this, it's very difficult to get that initial allocation of resources exactly right. And that's something that, the market with its price signals can adjust to over time.
Okay, I see. I see. So basically, this whole issue, the inherent complexity of an economy, it's something that Marx himself recognized in a way.
Right.
But it becomes a huge problem when you try to apply central planning to that.
Exactly.
Okay, so I guess that brings us to another key part of Sowell's critique, right, which is this whole issue of economic incentives.
Right.
And specifically, how Marxism kind of views human nature. Like, what does it assume about how people are motivated?
Yeah, and I think this is where Sowell really starts to delve into what he sees as some pretty optimistic assumptions,
Okay,
within Marxist thought about how people would behave in this kind of, ideal communist society.
right,
And, Marx was obviously a huge critic of capitalism.
right. He saw greed as a really big problem, right?
Exactly, yeah. He saw this boundless greed after riches, as he put it. But when he lays out his vision for a post-capitalist world, he doesn't always provide a very concrete explanation for, what would actually drive production and innovation.
Right, like if you don't have that profit motive, what is it that gets people to work hard and to come up with new ideas?
Exactly.
So what does he say?
Well, there seems to be this underlying idea that once you eliminate things like alienation of labor, where workers feel separated from their work and its products, that people would then find work intrinsically fulfilling.
Right, so they'd be doing it for the love of the game, not for some external reward.
Exactly. But I think Sowell questions whether that really holds true for every single person in every single kind of job that needs to be done.
Right, because not every job is necessarily inherently fulfilling, like somebody's got to take out the trash, right?
Exactly.
So it's not clear that everybody's going to be so inherently motivated that we can just do away with any kind of external incentive.
Right. And Sowell actually brings up, Engels himself recognized that even in this kind of socialist utopia, a worker couldn't actually receive the entire value of his product.
Oh, interesting. Why not?
Well, because some portion of it would have to be set aside, right, for things like public services, for investment in the future, and so on.
Right, right, of course. But then, if that's the case, how do you decide how much each person gets? How do you allocate labor and resources effectively if you don't have market signals or those individual rewards that are directly tied to output?
Exactly.
That's a huge question.
Right.
Okay, so it sounds like Sowell was saying that, Marxism might be kind of underestimating the need for those economic incentives. Like, it's great to think that everyone will just be motivated by, the good of the collective and the joy of work itself, but that might be a bit too idealistic in practice.
Right. And especially when you start to look at the historical experience with centrally planned economies,
Hmm.
they often struggled with motivating workers and with fostering real innovation. And
Wow.
these are areas where capitalist systems, for all of their flaws, have often been more dynamic because they do have those built-in incentives.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, I guess the big takeaway here is that, this whole issue of economic incentives, it's not just some like theoretical debate.
Right.
It has real practical implications for how an economy actually functions.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit now and take a look at the historical outcomes of Marxist policies. Because I know this is something that Sowell spends a lot of time analyzing in his book.
Yeah, this is really crucial to understanding his critique.
Okay.
And I think he would probably start by acknowledging that, Marx and Engels themselves were very clear about distinguishing their ideas from earlier forms of socialism.
Right, they didn't want to be lumped in with the utopians.
Exactly. They saw their approach as scientific socialism, rooted in this rigorous analysis of history and how societies develop.
Okay, so they were trying to ground their ideas in something more concrete than just, wishful thinking.
Right. But the irony, as Sowell points out, is that there's often this really stark contrast between those theoretical ideals of Marxism, the stateless, classless society, and what actually happened when Marxist revolutions took place. In the 20th century, we saw the emergence of all these centrally planned states that really didn't live up to the utopian vision.
Yeah, and in many cases, they ended up being quite authoritarian, right?
Exactly. And that's particularly striking when you think about, the whole concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was supposed to be this temporary phase leading to that ultimate classless society.
Right.
Marx even saw this as potentially compatible with democratic structures. He pointed to the Paris Commune as an example.
Okay.
But in practice, it often led to regimes that suppressed individual freedoms and really cracked down on any kind of dissent.
So not exactly the workers' paradise that was originally envisioned.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of, the increasing misery of the proletariat.
Right. That was like a key prediction of early Marxism.
Right. And it just didn't really materialize in the industrialized West the way that Marx predicted.
Yeah.
Living standards for workers generally improved under capitalism in a lot of these countries.
Right.
And Sowell sees this as a pretty major challenge to one of the fundamental tenets of Marxist theory.
Yeah, because if capitalism is supposed to be driving workers into deeper and deeper poverty, but the opposite is happening, then that really throws a wrench in the whole argument.
Exactly. And, Sowell even highlights how, key figures like Lenin had to significantly modify Marxist principles
Right.
in response to the specific conditions in Russia in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just a matter of applying this kind of universal blueprint. They had to make all these compromises and adjustments based on the realities on the ground.
So it kind of underscores the point that, theory is one thing, but actually putting it into practice in the real world, it's a whole other ballgame.
Exactly.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. I guess maybe to kind of wrap things up, one final area that I think we should touch on is this whole issue of, knowledge and information.
Yeah.
Because this seems to be a recurring theme in Sellers' work in general, just how important it is to have access to accurate information, especially in an economy.
Right. And that really connects back to the whole discussion about central planning, right?
Hmm.
Sowell emphasizes that knowledge in an economy, it's not concentrated in one place. It's incredibly dispersed.
Right.
You have consumers with their own individual preferences, producers with their own knowledge of how to make things. You have all this information about the availability of resources, and it's constantly changing.
Right. And so the challenge for central planners is that even if they had the best intentions, they just wouldn't be able to gather and process all of that information effectively.
Exactly. And, Marx, he really focused on labor as the primary source of value.
Right, which was kind of the prevailing view in classical economics at the time.
Right. But Sowell argues that this perspective kind of overlooks the crucial role of things like management, innovation, risk-taking, and the creation of new knowledge.
Right, because it's not just about how much labor goes into making something. It's also about how efficiently it's produced, how innovative the product is, whether there's a market for it, all of those things.
Exactly. And when you look at, the track record, market-oriented economies, even with all their imperfections, they've generally been much more successful at generating wealth and raising living standards
Right.
compared to those centrally planned economies. And I think Sowell sees that as, pretty strong evidence for his argument about the importance of knowledge and how it's used.
Right. So to sum up, Sowell's critique of Marxism really seems to boil down to a few key points. Number one, central planning. It sounds good in theory, but in practice, it's incredibly difficult to pull off because of the sheer complexity of an economy and the problem of trying to manage all of that information from the top down. Number two, economic incentives. You can't just assume that people are going to be intrinsically motivated to work hard and be productive. You need some kind of system of rewards and punishments to make sure that people's self-interest is aligned with the interests of society as a whole.
Exactly.
And number three, the historical record. When we look at the actual attempts to implement Marxist ideas, they often haven't turned out the way that was intended. And in many cases, they've led to authoritarianism, economic stagnation, and all sorts of other problems.
Right. And I think Sowell's point is that these aren't just accidental failures or misinterpretations of Marx. They actually stem from some pretty fundamental flaws in the theory itself.
Right, right. Okay, well, that's a really, really insightful overview. I think we covered a lot of ground today, and I really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
It's a really dense book, but I think we managed to tease out some of the key arguments, and hopefully this has given our listeners, a better understanding of why Marxism has faced so much pushback, both from other intellectuals and also in terms of its practical implementation.
Absolutely. And, even if you don't agree with all of Sowell's conclusions, I think his analysis is really valuable because it forces us to grapple with some really fundamental questions about how societies should be organized.
Right, like what is the best way to create a just and prosperous society?
Exactly. And there's no easy answers.
Absolutely not. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is.
And hopefully, this deep dive has sparked some interesting questions for our listeners. Maybe it's got you thinking about different economic and political systems, or maybe it's just made you want to go out and read more about Marxism and its critics.
Yeah, I hope so.
Whatever it is, we encourage you to keep exploring these topics. They're not always easy, but they're definitely important.
I agree.
All right, well, that's all for today. Thanks for joining us in the Book Nook.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.